Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman, Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, for our purposes, Monday, August 21st, 2017, the big total eclipse day, and I sit at the moment, though I am recording the show ahead of time, still sit at the moment just north of Charleston, South Carolina, awaiting my chance to be in the path of totality. I hope all of you have been able to get someplace, if you were so inclined, to observe this perhaps once-in-a-lifetime event, although I am now assured that in 2024, those of you in the central Texas area and then following a strange path, I guess, northeastward, will get another shot at totality in just a couple of years. So, well, let's hope your lifetime stretches until then, shall we? It shouldn't be difficult to do with regular diet and exercise, although that's a lot harder than it sounds sometimes. Anyway, what have we got planned for you today? I did want to take a stab at putting together a live show today, and it wasn't, in fact, the internet connection that prevented us from doing so, nor was it the unavailability of Greg Dworkin, who is no doubt just about chomping at the bit to get back into the game at this point. And I'm sorry, we'll have to delay things until later in the week. Thursday of this week, to be specific, as the kids head back to school, and we are back at the Kagro in the Morning World Headquarters official desk and ready and capable of patching him in for his roundup of morning news, desperately needed this morning. What's standing in the way of things this morning? A house full of kids. Everybody wanted to be in the path of totality and has joined us here. The kids are having a blast. Their cousins are here. It's just that they're having too much of a blast to really reliably be able to do a live show. Literally nowhere I can retreat to for quiet during the morning hours. What are the plans going forward for our show? Well, once again, a little bit of a tour through the archives, catch up on a couple of stories which we treated through the end of last week and into this week. Of course, when we left off at the end of last week, we were still discussing the fallout from the Charlottesville confrontation, marches, demonstrations, counter-demonstrations. Since then, of course, we have seen the attempt by the alt-right to stage another such confrontation, this time in Boston, which is an awfully stupid choice for them to have made. I don't know how many people they thought they were going to draw at this thing, but by most reports, it was no more than 100 and change showed up for the alt-right side of things. But depending on what estimates you accept, somewhere upwards of 20,000 counter demonstrators, maybe even more. It was really rather lopsided in terms of the turnout, which was very heartening and a good reminder that once again there are many people who operate on the theories, and it seems pretty credible, but it's just, I mean, the whole thing is it's hard to believe because it's designed to be hard to believe when you find out that, or when you hear the theory that the entirety of the alt-right really comprises not much more than a few hundred committed online activists, perhaps, and a few thousand committed or semi-committed followers and supporters around the country, and then an army of Russian Twitter bots that makes it seem like there are thousands or even hundreds of thousands of alt-right supporters that can be drawn upon to populate any such demonstration. So still unknown at this point is, one, whether that theory is actually true, or two, whether there are really, in fact, many thousands more that the alt-right could hope to draw on in real life, but who either were intimidated from showing up because of the nonviolent resistance to what they were doing, that is to say their identification, shaming online, singling out, and in many cases finding these people fired from their jobs, ostracized in their communities. A couple of younger student-aged alt-right supporters. What would we say about this? Pressured. Really, they came to their own conclusion that they were unwelcome in their academic communities and left school. A lot of weeping and sadness among these idiots for having had their lives destroyed. But, you know, Nazism is kind of an all-in ideology, I say. And I think you probably agree. And if your life is ruined because you became a Nazi, that's really, it comes with the territory. You either, you know, an ideology like that, you either win it all and remain atop the political hierarchy for life. I mean, that's the risk-reward system. If you take over the United States, well, you're in the catbird seat. But in the much more likely event that you are defeated, laughed at, pushed out, clobbered, dismissed from your work or academic pursuits, then, you know, that's the downside of it. Yeah, your life gets destroyed by becoming a Nazi. But, you know, it's only fair in that Nazism, of course, relies on the ability to destroy the lives of so many more who have made no conscious choice whatsoever about where they'll stand with regard to one or another radical ideologies. They were just living their lives. That's what Nazis do, and that's what Nazis risk. I'm not sad about any of those kids. Can't muster any sympathy for them, and please don't try to make me do it. Okay, but still pending out there is the question of whether any of the people who did not show up for the alt-right in Boston didn't show up because of the, if not violent, then certainly not entirely non-violent response that was also in evidence when Nazis and Klan members and other racists and bigots rear their heads in public. Nobody got severely beaten for being an alt-right rally participant, of which I'm aware. I'm certain that there are claims being made, but I haven't seen much in the way of credible evidence that shows that there was severe and lasting damage done to any of the alt-right side that showed up. But there were some pretty severe beatings meted out to counter-protesters. Of course, Heather Heyer killed for her participation in the counter-protest. Many others hospitalized. Hospitalized after beatings that took place elsewhere outside of the car attack at the counter-protest that killed Heather Heyer. So I guess I haven't seen what there is to weep about from the alt-right perspective, but yet lots of them either didn't show up in Boston, or there are some emerging stories of youthful participants in the alt-right march who on Saturday, when confronted with the potential for violent response, essentially immediately surrendered, stripping off the shirts identifying them as members of one alt-right group or another and pleading with counter-protesters, listen, I'm here for the lulz. I'm not really a Nazi. Don't do this to me. And for the most part, those kids seem to have escaped unscathed. So I'm still torn. I still have mixed feelings about it, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised about that. The alt-right, like the rest of America, is something of a complex mix of people with different motivations, different fears, different needs that they might be fulfilling with their cleaving to the alt-right cause. And some of them might be separated from the alt-right cause by one method more successfully, and others by another. I am unsure. Different Nazis will react differently to the different countering strategies brought to bear against them. There are almost certainly a large number of Nazis or would-be Nazis who, being lightly roughed up, might be enough to dissuade them from ever participating in public again. And if they remain private Nazis, that's not ideal, but it's a lot better than them showing up pretending to be public Nazis. there are, of course, other Nazis who I am sure react very differently to being threatened with violence or having actual violence visited upon them that might strengthen their resolve to remain Nazis. Then they will redouble their Nazi-like efforts. And in between, I'm sure there are all sorts. I was going to redouble my efforts had I been the victim of violence, but I am so impressed with the adherence to nonviolent tactics by the anti-fascist counter-demonstrators that I have changed my mind. Thank you, logic. I don't think that there are that many of those, but it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and jury is still out for me as to whether it is absolutely something that I have to warn against, the old punch a Nazi thing, or absolutely something I should be advocating at every turn. I don't know. And I suspect it differs for every Nazi, and probably in the mind of every counter-demonstrator as well. And we will see some success stories and some failures. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up, and I wanted to revisit some of the stories about the alt-right and how they came to be involved there, what they were doing in Charlottesville, where they came from, what motivates them, etc., etc. So I thought I could perhaps weave together a show that brought half dozen or so articles together, some of which I've been holding on to for a little while, some of which are more recent. These first two, I thought it was interesting to, I'll include these as follow-ups to stuff we discussed on what I believe ended up as Friday's show. Specifically, the question of where did these monuments come from anyway? What's the story behind these Confederate monuments? And I remember that we definitely discussed the tweet storm from the one of the University of Richmond faculty members. Is that right? Was it a professor or a librarian? I cannot recall now offhand. I'll have to bring up the story, but you'll recall that I was very impressed by this person's knowledge of the process by which the various Confederate statues and monuments around the country had come to be put in place. That is, that there was a conscious decision made at some point to try and increase the number of Confederate monuments in the number of places all over the country, and to try and use them to intimidate the local black population and to assert the rightness and the continuing rightness of white supremacy, and to try and whitewash the Civil War itself from the Confederate side and turn it into the lost cause movement, as opposed to, we were fighting for slavery and we were happy to do it. And let me see, I think I have not too far offhand a reference to the tweet storm that we had read. I wasn't sure I was going to go here right off the bat, but here we are. You remember that it was Tabor Andrew Bain, who tweets as Tabor, Taber, who had brought this to our attention and explained to us exactly where all these monuments had come from and why they were so cheap, and why the one we saw in Durham, North Carolina, did come down so easily. Since then, I've seen a lot of reporting on it, and I got to tell you, I've seen some good, some bad, some informed, some not so informed, and I saw at least one video presentation of it, in addition to a couple of write-ups here in the Washington Post, that, and the video presentation, I thought, covered all the same ground, but made no mention at all of this tweet storm, where we had gotten all this information before, and it really, it was reiterating a lot of the same points. I thought, Tabor deserves more credit for that, and I don't know if he's going to get it. So he'll get it here on this show. Anyway, I mentioned that the Washington Post had a couple of pieces on it. Mark Fisher has one here. Okay, so here's the Mark Fisher piece from Friday evening, August 18th in the Washington Post, why those Confederate soldier statues look a lot like their Union counterparts. We, of course, already knew the answer to this, but there's a little bit of extra information in here. The story is illustrated up top with two essentially identical-looking monuments. The one on the left, if you were looking at it, a monumental bronze company sculpture of a Union soldier erected in Westfield, New Jersey in 1889. On the right, a sculpture of a Confederate soldier by the same company erected in Windsor, North Carolina in 1898. And of course, we learned that the Monumental Bronze Company was the one churning out the extraordinarily cheap statues for just this purpose. And they didn't particularly care whether you were in the North or the South, as long as you paid them for the statue. And probably in the 1880s, 1890s, and really right up until today, because we remain more or less ignorant of this stuff, you could be pretty sure that you were going to get away with it, because there was no chance that the people of Windsor, North Carolina were going to saunter over to Westfield, New Jersey and say, hey, that looks exactly the same as our monument. Or even if you did, you'd probably say, well, most of the soldiers looked more or less the same in terms of the idealized figures that we had of them in our heads. Of course, in reality, they looked incredibly different because, especially for the Confederates, they had no standard uniforms, et cetera, but no need to get into history. We can talk about fake stuff instead. So let's take a look at this article. President Trump's supportive comments about Confederate monuments have focused new attention on long-ignored Civil War statues of a mustachioed infantryman standing at rest, wearing a greatcoat and holding a rifle barrel. The nameless figure, known to many as the Silent Sentinel, we definitely read about that, gazes over town squares and courthouse steps of dozens of southern towns, but not just there. Many of the South's silent sentinels turn out to be identical to the statues of Union soldiers that decorate hundreds of public squares across the North. Identical, but for one detail: the soldier's belt buckle. The U.S. is replaced by a CS for Confederate states. It turns out that a campaign in the late 19th century to memorialize the Civil War by erecting monuments was not only an attempt to honor Southern soldiers or white supremacy, it was also a remarkably successful bit of marketing sleight of hand in which a New England monument company, or several New England monument companies, sold the same statues to towns and citizens groups on both sides of the Civil War divide. It took some years before Southern customers caught on. I don't know who was supposed to catch on first, but before Southern customers caught on and sought to buy statues of soldiers who were more obviously grays rather than blues, statue manufacturers eventually gave their Confederate models a slouch hat instead of a Union topper that looked more like a baseball cap, and a short shell jacket rather than the North's greatcoat, and a bedroll to replace the Union man's knapsack. Let's see. The next part of the story is illustrated by a statue pulled down in 1900 in Elberton, Georgia. An angry crowd pulled down and buried this statue of a Confederate soldier because it looked too much like a Union fighter. It was dug up in 1982 and now resides in a local museum. How interesting. The story continues here. Dozens of North and South statues are all but precise copies. I've spent hours staring at the creases on their pants, and Yankee or Rebel, they're often exactly the same, said Sarah Beetham, an art historian at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, who has studied the mass production of Civil War monuments. I knew somebody was on the job there. Indeed, the Union and Confederate versions of the soldier statue were probably constructed from the same prefabricated parts. The meaning of a memorial is never set in stone, but the people who commission it might have one message in mind, but those who view the monument in generations that follow may draw entirely different lessons. True. And a good point, by the way, for all the people who are allegedly, they now, I don't know whether this would stand up to scrutiny, but they allege, so long as they're not challenged, to be interested in preserving the statues because they themselves teach history, one absolute and forever kind of history, unchanging. You can't change history, says, of course, the guy who has the fake monument on his on his golf course, etc., etc. Oh, and I had forgotten that he also, you can't change history, he stole some other family's coat of arms at one point, right? Remember? And didn't he remove the word integrity and just put Trump in as the motto on the banner? Anyway, so no such thing as one single universally recognized and unchanging history. It should come as no surprise that those who commission it might have one message in mind. Those who view it later may have entirely different lessons drawn. The one generation's hero becomes another generation's symbol of inhumanity. One reason Americans eventually turned away from statues of great men on horses, instead choosing stones decorated with lists of those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Ooh, another good point. In the case of the Confederate statues that have turned into powerful and, to many, disturbing symbols more than 150 years after the war, the Southern women who paid for most of the statues between 1880 and 1920 said they wanted a place to honor the fallen husbands and fathers, their fallen husbands and fathers. But the communities that erected those statues were also looking for a way to assert their doctrine of white supremacy at a time when they were passing Jim Crow laws to codify the separation of the races. To the Monumental Bronze Company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, it was all just business. Union or Confederate, a customer was a customer. Another $450 for a zinc statue that could mean whatever you wanted it to mean. It was a business model that could appeal to Donald Trump, a highly profitable product that could dress up a drab little town and make many Americans feel great again. That's a nice way of putting it. As Civil War veterans gained political clout near the end of the 1880s, they lobbied for pensions. In the South, their wives, sisters, and daughters, organized as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, raised funds and purchased statues, sparking an unprecedented monument boom. Because of technological innovations in the granite and bronze industries, the prices of these statues came way down, said Kirk Savage, an art historian at the University of Pittsburgh and the author of Standing Soldiers, Kneeling Slaves, Race, War, and Monument in the 19th Century America. Tiny little hamlets in New England and the Southeast could suddenly afford monuments. Wealthier cities such as Richmond and Baltimore could afford to hire professional sculptors to create original works in bronze, often drawn from melted down Civil War cannons, featuring generals such as Robert E. Lee or Thomas Stonewall Jackson, but those statues cost thousands. The marketing mavens at Monumental Bronze served a much larger market with cheap soldier statues made of zinc, a bargain at $450 for a life-size model, $750 for the 8.5-foot jumbo version. Monumental offered something rare for the day, one-stop shopping. Order your soldier and Monumental would ship the prefabricated parts and send someone to your hometown to put it all together and get that baby up on a pedestal before the folks over in the next town got theirs. The monument makers weren't interested in ideology or the moral cause, Savage said. They just saw a market and lunged for it. Some northern foundries had made armaments during the Civil War and were now searching for a new line. They made cemetery monuments, steady work but not a path to explosive growth. War memorials looked promising. About 2,500 soldier statues were erected in the North and about 500 in the South, Beetham said. This celebration of ordinary soldiers was a revolutionary break from the classic commemoration of great men on horses. Monumental sold its statues as everlasting white bronze, which they advertised as a decided improvement over marble and granite. This wasn't true, Beetham said. The zinc statues tended to flake apart at the seams or lean backward in a very unmilitary posture. Still, those statues forever changed how Americans pictured Civil War combatants. Our concept of what a Yankee or a rebel looked like comes more from these post-war representations in monuments than from what they actually wore, Beetham said. When Southerners saw statues that looked too much like those depicting Union boys, they rebelled. In 1900, in Alberton, Georgia, an angry crowd gathered in the middle of the night and pulled down a statue of a Confederate soldier because the sculptor, a Southerner as it turns out, had put a long overcoat, a staple of Union uniforms, on the young man, probably to save the labor of carving out 2 full legs. It was the sculptor's poor first attempt, Beetham said. The soldier looked like he was out of a Keebler elf cookie. To the good folks of Alberton, he looked like a Yankee interloper. Down he tumbled. Oh my goodness. Durham wasn't the first time a Civil War statue was pulled down. It's amazing. Townspeople dug a hole in the middle of Alberton's main square and buried the offending statue face down. It was dug up in 1982, now resides in a local museum, as we mentioned earlier. Alberton then replaced the statue with one from Monumental Bronze's catalog. They replaced a monument made by a local Southern sculptor with a true Yankee interloper made in Connecticut, Beetham said. Southern communities were generally quiet about the source of their Confederate statues. The United Daughters of the Confederacy had little choice but to buy from the North or from Europe, because that's where the foundries were. For decades after the war, the South was still battle-ravaged and almost uniformly agricultural. Now here's the really interesting part. The Confederate monument boom was driven almost entirely by women. It was politically dicey for Confederate veterans to be seen as advocating for their former cause, Beetham said. The men want to be able to own property. They want to be able to vote. They can only do that if they've clearly laid down their arms and sworn allegiance to the United States. Women don't have to worry about any of that. They can't own property. They can't vote. So they hide behind their femininity and say, we just want a monument to have a place to lay our flowers. Very interesting. The women were freer to put up those monuments than the men were. The music, of course, means we need to take a short break for station identification. We'll do that and be back with you in just a moment. And welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show right here on Netroots Radio. Thanks for hanging on with us to the end of our first station identification break. When we last left off, we were discussing the rather interesting fact that it was the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the women, especially down in the South, who were chiefly responsible for financing the purchase of and erection of these statues in the South, anyway. And very interesting twist to why that was the case, why the women had to take care of this business. The men, of course, were busy keeping up appearances of loyalty to the United States. And it is interesting that now that gives us an extra angle to think about on this. The women, I guess, it wouldn't have evidenced more or less, loyalty to the United States than had men done it, I guess. It should, by rights, have been seen as disloyal to the Union, to the United States. It shouldn't matter what gender you are when you buy the statue. It was only that they didn't particularly care if they were seen as disloyal to the United States, because the penalty for disloyalty to the United States was that you would lose the right to own property or vote, which was a right that they didn't have anyway, which also, by the way, would be a tacit admission, I guess, if you really think this through, that the otherwise passive enjoyment of the placement of such statues around the South by the menfolk who didn't pay for it would also, obviously, then have to be seen as disloyalty to the United States. But we seem to have set that whole thing up. Even in our articles re-examining how these statues came to be and how they came to be so widespread, we won't lay the blame for disloyalty to the United States at the feet of the people to whom it properly belongs. It's very interesting and a kind of a subtle point set aside in this article. Anyway, where were we? We had just recapped how it was the Daughters of the Confederacy. It was that the actual name? Yeah, United Daughters of the Confederacy, who had done all the payment, and their excuse was no, we're not being disloyal to the United States. We just want a nice place to lay our flowers in remembrance of the fathers and brothers and sons, etc., who we lost. Now, cemetery would be a great place for that, too, but they wanted a statue in the middle of a square because of reasons. All right? Anyway, that wasn't the end of the article. We continue here. The monument business fell off after World War I. Although many towns bought doughboy statues, the great man monument really fades out, Savage said. Sculpted tributes to common soldiers remained the rule after World War II as well. The iconic image of Iwo Jima, for example, but in the decades since, the influence of abstract art and rising cynicism about the role of great men in history have altered the nature of monuments. Abstract forms such as Washington's Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall and the 9/11 memorials in Manhattan and at the Pentagon became more common. That's probably true, and it's a good analysis, I think, and a good point. Interesting that, the common soldier was more the focus of these monuments afterwards. Although I think it also increasingly became the case that the great men, such as they were, or the people who would become the great men, the generals and commanders, I think were less often to be seen in a credible great man pose. The Civil War would pretty much have been the last time, for instance, you would have seen a general of either side mounted and even observing the battle from close enough to, hear the battle. Whereas, I'm guessing that for the most part, when you're talking about generals going forward, World War I, World War II, etc., though there are surely commanders that place themselves in great jeopardy, and there are, of course, commanders who were killed and sacrificed their lives in all the flowery language that you're supposed to lay on top of this stuff. In the causes in which they fought, they weren't on horseback, and everybody knows a guy on horseback is awesome. And what would they look like? They stand there with binoculars, sit at a desk, on a telephone, sit around in a boardroom table. There's no action drama involved in the pose, no heroic pose in which to portray them. And certainly there are monuments to senior military leaders post Civil War, but it's very interesting. I mean, there are certain people, I guess, who have a presence strong enough that it doesn't matter that they're not doing anything heroic looking. Their reputations speak for themselves, but for the most part, I think, I don't know, the equestrian statue wasn't an option that was available anymore. You could show a picture of a guy in a Jeep. That's not, it's just not going to do it for most people. Anyway, starting in World War I, or with World War I, the article continues, there was a very strong anti-monument movement, in large part in reaction to the Civil War monuments, which were seen as glorifying war, Savage said. Instead, living memorials became popular. Public spaces such as parks, fountains, stadiums, and auditoriums named for veterans. But demand for statues never went away, especially from veterans groups. The motivation remains steady, Savage said. We want our story, our pain, and our sacrifice to be recognized. Absolutely, still true. Just an interesting historical shift post World War I guess. Very interesting. Now, another approach to this whole subject, also featured in the Washington Post, though actually before this past piece was printed. I picked this one up. Karen L. Cox wrote this one. The whole point of Confederate monuments is to celebrate white supremacy. Now, that seems true, and it, I think, seems like something we picked up on in the last couple of days, or last couple episodes in discussing this thing. But let me bring this one forward, see what you think of this one. The rally by white nationalists to defend the monument to Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville last weekend, and the destruction of a monument to Confederate soldiers in Durham, North Carolina 2 days later, have stoked the ongoing debate over these statues. President Trump suggested Tuesday that the torchlight rally by neo-Nazis and other white supremacists was merely a defense of the past. So this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson is coming down. Where would he see that? I don't even know. I wonder, is it George Washington next week? Is it Thomas Jefferson the week after that? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop? On Thursday, he picked the argument back up on Twitter. Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. Who's next? Washington? Jefferson? So foolish. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be completely replaced. But what do we learn from the history of these monuments? Are they truly innocuous symbols of Confederate heritage, as their defenders argue? The facts tell us otherwise. Almost none of the monuments were put up right after the Civil War. Some were erected during the Civil Rights era of the early 1960s, which coincided with the war's centennial. But the vast majority of monuments date to between 1895 and World War I. They were part of a campaign to paint the Southern cause in the Civil War as just, and slavery as a benevolent institution, and their installation came against the backdrop of Jim Crow violence and oppression of African Americans. The monuments were put up as explicit symbols of white supremacy. By the way, that led to an interesting discussion about the propriety of these monuments and the overblown conservative complaint that you were erasing history, that going to the Gettysburg battlefield and clearing it of all of its statues and monuments was some sort of attempt to erase inconvenient history or something like that. Although then lots of people tried to turn it around and say, well, Democrats want to remove these statues, and the painful fact for them is that most of these Confederate generals were Democrats. And while true, of course, and we could spend lots of time discussing how the ideology of the parties changed a great deal. I think you all know that. Another question might be, for instance, if these are statues of Democrats and Democrats want to take them down, what business have you Republicans in preventing it from happening? But of course they say, well, I'm trying to prevent the erasure of history. What are you going to do? You're going to raise our hallowed battlegrounds now? And no, we should probably differentiate between monuments in public spaces and out in front of like the courthouse or other public squares, or naming schools for Confederate generals or streets or anything, public parks, etc. It's one thing to say a battle happened here, and here is a monument to the people who fought it, and you will see this monument if you come to the battlefield, if you seek it out, if you come looking for the battlefield to experience it for historical purposes, you will see these monuments. I cannot help if you're offended once you get here. Why did you come here if you were going to be triggered by the battlefield? On the other hand, a Confederate monument put up in front of the courthouse very clearly sends this message. In this courthouse, we are Confederates. In this courthouse, if you would have stood in opposition to the Confederacy, you might very well expect no justice here, and that you should be on notice of that. That's a very different message than historical memorabilia or marking the spot where something happened. And even if you mark it with an emotionally charged monument, at least it happened here. If you want to come visit this place, be prepared for this. If you want to conduct your day-to-day life here, you shouldn't be intimidated. Anyway, returning to the article here, the group responsible for the majority of these memorials, we now know, of course, was the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the UDC, herein for short, among the most influential white women's organizations in the South in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Honoring Confederate heroes, generals, and soldiers was one of its primary objectives, and hundreds of monuments throughout the South and beyond serve as testimony to the Daughters' aggressive agenda to vindicate the Confederacy. The lasting power of the mythology they created is evident today in the raging battles over the fate of the memorials. While Baltimore acted quickly to take down 4 Confederate monuments in that city Tuesday night, Laws prevent the removal of such memorials in some states that seceded from the Union during the Civil War. Can we say that again? There are laws on the books that prevent the removal of these memorials. Why in the world would there be such a thing? Because there's an agenda behind it. That's how you get to laws, period. Most of these laws were passed only recently, by the way, in reaction to calls to remove the monuments or change street names honoring Confederate generals. The 1890s, when the UDC was founded and monument building began in earnest, was a decade of virulent racism across the South. Not content to disenfranchise black men, Southern whites went on a lynching spree. Ida B. Wells, the African-American journalist and anti-lynching crusader, documented 186 lynchings of black people in 1893 alone. Mostly men, but women and children too. As she wrote in her account, The Red Record, these scenes of unusual brutality failed to have any visible effect upon the humane sentiments of the people of our land. Violence against blacks only increased in the early decades of the 20th century. In addition to continued lynching across the South, the Atlanta race riot of 1906 demonstrated how seriously white men took their supremacy over African Americans. An estimated 10,000 white men and boys in the city went after black men, beating dozens to death and injuring hundreds more. Amid that brutality, the pace of Confederate monument construction quickened. The UDC and other like-minded heritage organizations were intent on honoring the Confederate generation and establishing a revisionist history of what they called the War Between the States. According to this lost cause mythology, the South went to war to defend states' rights. Slavery was essentially a benevolent institution that imparted Christianity to African savages. And while the Confederates were defeated, theirs was a just cause, and those who fought were heroes. The Daughters regarded the Ku Klux Klan, which had been founded to resist Reconstruction, as a heroic organization necessary to return order to the South. Order, of course, meant the use of violence to subdue newly freed blacks. During the era of Jim Crow, Confederate monuments could be placed most anywhere. Some were in cemeteries or parks, but far more were erected on the grounds of local and state courthouses. These monuments, then, not only represented reverence for soldiers who fought in a war to defend slavery, they also made a very pointed statement about the rule of white supremacy. All who enter the courthouse are subject to the laws of white men. Monument building and the suppression of African Americans did not occur in a Southern Jim Crow vacuum. White Northerners were complicit, either through their silence or via the process of sectional reconciliation. Many shared white Southerners' beliefs about what was then called Anglo-Saxon supremacy. Northerners likened immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe to the South's Negro problem, and essentially turned a blind eye to the violence used to subdue African Americans. That reconciliation took many forms during the era of Jim Crow. For instance, white audiences across the nation showed their appreciation for the South in popular culture. During the early decades of the 20th century, they bought the sheet music of Dixie songs, whose words glorified the Old South, by the millions. The most successful film of the silent era, The Birth of a Nation, and the best-selling book of 1936 and 37, Gone with the Wind, which also became an international film sensation, were essentially popular celebrations of white supremacy and Southern civilization. Monuments, though, were much more tangible signs of reconciliation. The ultimate such symbol was the Confederate memorial unveiled in Arlington National Cemetery in the summer of 1914. On June 3rd, Jefferson Davis's birthday. This whole story is incredible, isn't it? Union veterans joined Confederate veterans, and members of the Daughters of the American Revolution joined members of the UDC for the dedication of what was billed as a peace monument. The peace may have been about ending hostility between the regions, but the monument itself honors a lost cause narrative that met the white South's litmus test, as it contains heroic images of Confederate soldiers faithful slaves and wording that vindicates their cause. While Confederate monuments honor their white heroes, they do not always rely on the true history of what took place between 1861 and 1865, nor was that their intent. Rather, they serve to rehabilitate white men, not as the losers of a war, but as a monument in Charlotte states, preservers of the Anglo-Saxon civilization of the South. Today's defenders of Confederate monuments are either unaware of the historical context or do not care. Like generations of whites before them, they are more invested in the mythology that has attached itself to these sentinels of white supremacy because it serves their cause. And that is the wrap-up on that article. Very interesting, I think very true. It probably didn't teach us that much that we didn't know, although there's a lot of really interesting detail in there, too. But yes, it eventually does get around to bringing up the very good point that battlefield monuments, battlefield memorials, are a very different thing than installing in very public places, where the very place where you're supposed to go to be able to seek equal justice under law, and find instead a statue standing for the proposition that there is no justice available to you unless you're white. Wow. Very different, and I'm glad we were able to add that to the mix, too. Now, I want to stay on this topic for a second, and I'll reserve the right to change the direction of the show. That is, the direction of the show that I had planned, and stay on this topic for just a little while longer for this purpose, to bring you another story I set aside that I think follows on these two pieces a lot better. And this is from Adrian LaFrance and Van Newkirk, who wrote this together in The Atlantic, The Lost History of an American Coup d'etat. Republicans and Democrats in North Carolina are locked in a battle over which party inherits the shame of Jim Crow, is the subtitle of this August 12th piece in The Atlantic, which it came to mind while I was reading the prior piece, essentially because it reminded me, one of the message of intimidation that was being brought to bear by placing these Confederate memorials outside of courthouses in particular. And two, because of the recollection in that article of, one in particular, but of many riots around the country wherein the white population sought out and beat, murdered, and lynched really at random among the black population in some of these places. This was really an amazing story, and just another reminder, by the way, I mean, for all the complaining that people are doing about, we're wiping out history, or we're forgetting history, or somehow erasing history by taking down these monuments, there's a huge portion of our history which at least most of white America has forgotten. And I guess I can sympathize in this sense. It was a horrible thing, and I'd like to pretend it never happened too, I guess, if I could have, my way about anything. Or I guess I would say I would rather it just didn't happen. I wouldn't really, given the choice, want to pretend it didn't, because that's even worse. I just wish it didn't, but it did, and we owe it to everybody to remember that it did. But this tells the story, and it answers the question that a lot of people who are relatively ignorant of history sometimes put to people considering all sorts of civil rights activity and black liberation activity, and asking the dumb question of, well, why don't they just do it this way? Or why can't they be peaceful? Or why don't they vote like everybody else, or try this or that like everybody else does, meaning white people? And the answer is in stories like this. They did that, and you murdered them anyway. And so could they not be excused for coming to the conclusion that you just felt like murdering them and continue to feel like murdering them no matter what they do? Let's stop pretending that if they just pretended to be white, you'd leave them alone. That's clearly not a real answer. But why don't we just get to the more organized thoughts of Adrian LaFrance and Van Newkirk here. We'll begin on it, and then partway in, we'll We'll take a second or third break in the show. And what are we up to? The second break? Yeah. And continue on the other side. Okay. Starts out this way. By the time the fire started, Alexander Manly had vanished. That didn't stop the mob of 400 people who had reached his newsroom from making good on their promise. The crowd, led by a former congressman, had given the editor-in-chief an ultimatum: destroy your newspaper and leave town forever, or we will wreck it for you. Keep in mind, please, that the Charlottesville rally/riot and the Boston gathering were, of course, billed as free speech rallies. I mean, obviously, these aren't the same people personally pulling off both of these things, but for all the honoring of the history and heritage of free speech in this country, we seem to forget incidents like this one. The story continues, of course, that they then burned the Daily Record to the ground. It was the morning of November 10th, 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina, and the fire was the beginning of an assault that took place 7 blocks east of the Cape Fear River, about 10 miles inland from the Atlantic Ocean. By sundown, Manly's newspaper had been torched. As many as 60 people had been murdered, and the local government that was elected 2 days prior had been overthrown and replaced by white supremacists. That's probably the most astonishing part of this for me. The new local government elected 2 days prior, overthrown and replaced by white supremacists. For all the violent moments in United States history, the mob's gruesome attack was unique. It was the only coup d'etat ever to take place on American soil, and it very clearly is a coup d'etat, and yet not remembered that way, I guess, by the white historians of the era. What happened that day was nearly lost to history. For decades, the perpetrators were cast as heroes in American history textbooks. The black victims were wrongly described as instigators. Well, both sides are to blame, of course, except one side. The white side isn't, but the other side is instigators. You get the idea. It's been around a while. It took nearly a century for the truth of what had really happened to begin to creep back into public awareness. Today, the old site of the Daily Record is a nondescript church parking lot, an ordinary-looking square of matted grass on a tree-lined street in historic Wilmington. The Wilmington Journal, a successor of sorts to the old Daily Record, stands in a white clapboard house across the street. But there's no evidence of what happened there in 1898. No monument. It's weird. How do we know our history? I guess in that sense, we don't. But the idea, of course, of tearing down a statue of Robert E. Lee and then immediately forgetting who he is seems a little more far-fetched. Conservatives in North Carolina don't often bring up the Wilmington Massacre. Even many of those North Carolinians who are now aware of it are still reluctant to talk about it. Those who do sometimes stumble over words like insurrection and riot, like I do. Loaded terms and imprecise ones. Not only was it a coup, though, the massacre was arguably the nadir of post-slavery racial politics. That's why it was so shocking when on Monday, the state's GOP executive director, Dallas Woodhouse, openly acknowledged the massacre on Twitter. In response to a tweet from the North Carolina Democratic Party about the Voting Rights Act, Woodhouse criticized what he saw as hypocrisy. The events of November 10th, 1898 were a result of the long-range campaign strategy by Democratic Party leaders to regain political control of Wilmington, he wrote. At that time, the state's most populous city, and North Carolina in the name of white supremacy. Now, Woodhouse may have been more interested in gaining political points than actually probing a painful memory in North Carolina's history. He didn't respond, by the way, to a request for an interview on this subject, but Woodhouse's version is actually much closer to the truth of what transpired than many other accounts. A capsule history of Alfred Moore Waddell, the former member of Congress who led the massacre, from the website of the Cape Fear Historical Institute in Wilmington, exemplifies what some students were long taught. The Democrats and most white citizens of the state feared a return to the corrupt and financially devastating rule of Republicans as had been experienced during Reconstruction in the late 1860s. Waddell led the white Wilmingtonians in their effort to shut down a racially inflammatory black newspaper, and then became mayor of Wilmington after the unpopular Republican regime had resigned. As mayor, Waddell quickly restored sobriety and peace, demonstrating his capacity to act with courage in critical times. He continued in this office until 1905, leading a responsible and honest government. That passage was written by Bernhard Thursum, I'm guessing at the pronunciation, who is a former chair both of the Cape Fear Museum Board and the state chapter of the League of the South. While Thursum's account diverges sharply from the documentary record, it is instructive in one regard. Thursum clearly identifies 19th century Republicans as liberals or radicals, and in his writing often identifies 19th century Democrats simply as conservative. Easier to understand then, isn't it? We will return to this fascinating story on the other side of this next break for station identification. We'll be right back. And we're back with more of the Kagro in the Morning Show right here on Netroots Radio, picking up where we left off just before the break, a continuation of this really fascinating story of the lost history of the coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina. Just to make sure we don't get ourselves into a War of the Worlds moment here, we are talking, of course, about the forgotten history of this coup d'etat in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. In the Trump era, I don't need any confusion. I don't want to worry anybody if you're just waking up or joining the show. There hasn't, at this moment, been a coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina. It is an historical event that we're referring to here. Let's continue. According to the historian David S. Ceselsky, presenting Waddell as a righteous campaigner for sobriety and peace was standard in Wilmington until the 1990s. I grew up in a small town in eastern North Carolina, 90 miles from Wilmington, Ceselsky says. I had a book in my middle school classroom that listed the 12 greatest North Carolinians ever. It included the Wright brothers, who weren't really North Carolinian, were they? Virginia Dare, and then it included 3 of the people who were the leaders of the white supremacy campaign. For something like Wilmington in 1898, Ceselsky continues, it's hard to describe the levels of indoctrination. In the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, they bragged about the coup. After that, they backed off, but it stayed in the history books, and they talked about it as an unfortunate but necessary event. In fact, part of how historians have pieced together the real story of the Wilmington Massacre is by looking back at newspaper archives from towns all across North Carolina, not just Wilmington, where similar violence was coordinated that day. They burned down black newspapers all over the state, Ceselsky says. They shut down entry to the city from blacks and Republicans. It's important not to forget that this was a planned thing. This wasn't 2 people getting in a fight in a street corner and sparking underlying racial tensions or something like that. Well, not much mentioned in history books anymore. But state officials solidified their grip on power by promoting that very fiction. They originally called the 1898 incident the Wilmington Race Riot, with the implication that the event was instigated by a riot from blacks and quelled by Waddell's fighters. After open celebration of white supremacist violence lost favor, a sort of bland sanitizing of history dominated recollections that lasted until around the time of the centennial of the massacre in 1998, when scholars and the descendants of the Wilmington black community that had been nearly destroyed in 1898 began to push for recognition of what really happened. The state's acknowledgement of its 70-year reign of white supremacy during the Solid South period followed the same pattern. Men like Charles B. Aycock, an agitator of the Wilmington riots, who 3 years later was elected governor on a platform of white supremacy, were revered in the state until recently, and in some cases still are. Glenda Gilmore, a North Carolina native and a professor of history at Yale, refers to the whitewashed period as a 50-year black hole of information. According to Gilmore, the bloody history of white supremacy was largely unacknowledged in the state's educational system. Someone like me, I never heard the word lynching until I was 21, she says. This history was totally hidden from white children, and that was deliberate. I wondered about that during the reading of the previous piece. I wondered how much of the true history might have been hidden from the people who eventually formulated the Daughters of the Confederacy, and how much of it they were willfully ignoring. I mean, I could see certainly the what I understand to be the culture of the South trying, I guess, to protect women from the reality of the situation, but I could also see, of course, willfully ignoring the reality of the situation too. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that one. I just wondered. Well, at least with the case of children, we're assured by Glenda Gilmore the effort was deliberate. But now that history is being uncovered and spread, Aycock's legacy has been reconsidered, and the collection of buildings and landmarks named after him in the state has dwindled. The Wilmington Massacre is widely acknowledged as a coup and as a foundational moment in creating a white supremacist state. North Carolina Republicans have helped uncover that history as well, although some of their acknowledgments of the legacy of white supremacy have come with partisan strings attached. In 2007, back when he was a first-term state General Assembly representative, Senator Tom Tillis blocked a state resolution formally apologizing for the massacre. He'd supported the nonpartisan resolution with the caveat that it included an amendment from him that, quote, would have acknowledged the historical fact that the white Republican government joined with black citizens to oppose the rioters. When that amendment failed, the resolution died with it. Nationally, conservatives have often taken a similar tack, embracing long-suppressed bits of historical knowledge about the full scope of white supremacy, so long as they can use them to attack Democrats. The Conservative American Civil Rights Union, which is run by members of President Donald Trump's Voter Fraud Commission, released a report in 2014 on the truth about Jim Crow. While the report is a cogent and relatively unglossed look at an era in which we proved ourselves to be as capable of committing great evil as any nation on earth, the titular truth appears not to be the legacy of the era, but that a great American political party is capable of subordinating the good of the nation and of humanity to its own selfish interest. Of course, this kind of weaponization of history is most effective if the Republican and Democratic parties are viewed as unbroken ideological identities dating back to the days of Abraham Lincoln. North Carolina's own history obliterates that view. Like the rest of the South, the state experienced mass party realignment after the 1960s civil rights movement, when Southern whites began to abandon the Democratic Party. Former Senator Jesse Helms, another Carolinian folk hero whose legacy is the subject of an ongoing controversy, was central to that realignment. Born and raised a Democrat in the Solid South, Helms switched parties in 1970, 2 years before his first Senate run. In 1974, Helms remarked of his decision, "The party veered so far to the left nationally and was taken over by the people whom I'd describe as substantially left of center in North Carolina, and I think I felt, as many other Democrats felt and feel, that I really had no real faith in the party. But I didn't do anything about it. Changing parties, changing party registration is like moving from a church. But President Nixon's speech at Kansas State, I think it was, persuaded me that maybe the Republican Party in North Carolina and in the nation had a chance to restore the two-party system." After the New Deal, the Supreme Court's desegregation ruling in Brown v. Board in 1954 and the Civil Rights Movement, Helms shepherded white conservatives of the Solid South to the Republican Party, but continued the old Democratic Party's hard line against civil rights reforms. And his legacy still reverberates within the North Carolina GOP that he helped build. Partisanship didn't quite move along the exact same ideological lines in the past, and both parties' histories indicate a push and pull between North and South, social conservatism and liberalism, economic orientations, populism and authoritarianism, big government and states' rights, and races. And across those spectra, politicians of all stripes have contributed to enduring racial inequalities, but white social conservatism was undoubtedly the driving force of democratic white supremacist regimes in the South, and its reaction to the loss of the hegemony is part of what precipitated the rise of the modern Republican Party. Whether he intends it or not, Woodhouse's acknowledgement of the Wilmington Massacre is also acknowledgement of how that hegemony was created, and that the political movement to which he belongs can trace its roots back to the murder of black citizens and the violent overthrow of a government they elected. Lost in that fire that destroyed the Daily Record were the lives of black citizens and the spirit of a thriving black community, and also the most promising effort in the South to build racial solidarity. In wielding the memory of the massacre in an attack against the Democrats, Woodhouse runs the risk of implicating his own party in those losses. But history serves higher purposes than blame. It can be employed in understanding the remnants of that white supremacist regime today and learning how to truly defeat the ills of Jim Crow. In honoring the past and the victims of Wilmington, history places the responsibility of racial equality at the feet of all political parties and all Americans. So can I change gears one more time here? Totally taking things in yet another different direction. It occurs to me that I have another story that requires updating. Something I told you about a couple weeks back now, and I have since had the update handed to me. A number of you have sent this story to me, and I haven't gotten a chance to get back on the air with it yet. But do you remember the story of the Sea Star? That is the letter C dash Star. The Sea Star was the rescue, or rather the non-rescue, the anti-rescue ship, hired by the Defend Europe racists to go out there and essentially harass the rescue boats that patrolled the Mediterranean and the waters in the region, looking for migrants who might be in need of rescue at sea. And the weirdos of Defend Europe and the identity movement, etc., joined by the weirdos from Canada's alt-right, who had leased this thing and had all sorts of difficulty getting their act together. It turns out, they've encountered yet more difficulty, and they haven't done any better in the days since. So this is this is an older story now at this point, but and there were a couple of versions of it, but the most informative, I guess, was the Dreyer report written up at the Independent, the UK newspaper, the Independent. So I picked this one up. Refugee rescue boat sent to help far-right anti-immigrant ship stranded in Mediterranean with mechanical failure. That is to say, Defend Europe and their boat broke down out at sea and had to be rescued by one of the rescue ships. And guess what? They refused their help. That is pure genius. Any way you slice it. Here's the story. Volunteers on a German refugee rescue ship have been deployed to help a vessel chartered by far-right activists that became stranded in the central Mediterranean. CI, and that's SEAEYE, CI, said Italian officials told their crew that the Sea Star, operated by an anti-immigration group calling itself Defend Europe, had suffered a mechanical failure and could not maneuver. A spokesperson for CI, which is among those Defend Europe has accused of colluding with Libyan people smugglers, said it was prepared to offer any aid needed. Michael Buschhaus, Buschheuer, as my best guess at his last name, Michael Buschheuer, the chairman of CI, said, "To help a ship in distress is the duty of anyone at sea, without regard for their origin, race, religion, or beliefs." But when his ship approached the crew of the Sea Star reportedly refused help. CI took on a course towards the Sea Star and got in contact with the right-wing extremists, but they refused any help, a spokesperson said. On the instructions of the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center in Rome, the CI continued its search for shipwrecks and drownings. Defend Europe confirmed its ship was suffering a minor technical problem that was being resolved. Sea Star developed a minor technical problem during the night, a spokesperson said, saying that its engine was stopped so it could be fixed. This means that under maritime laws to prevent collisions, the vessel is considered not under command, and information was sent out to vessels nearby in accordance with regulations. The problem is about to be resolved. That's what they said. The group, an offshoot of the white nationalist identitarian movement, crowdfunded its ship with claims that it would target criminal NGOs, as they put it, that are nothing less than part of the international human trafficking ring. Defend Europe claims the rescuing of refugees from the Mediterranean Sea, where more than 2,400 men, women, and children have drowned so far this year, is part of an invasion endangering the continent. The mission has been beset with difficulties that saw it delayed by several weeks, switching the launch to Cyprus from Sicily, where anti-racist campaigners and journalists had gathered last month. The Sea Star, a chartered ship, was stopped in the Suez Canal for security checks before journeying to northern Cyprus, where crew members were arrested over people smuggling allegations. They were later freed after claiming that Sri Lankan crew members on board were apprentice sailors who were supposed to disembark in Egypt. Oh, so they really did smuggle some people in. Interesting. Humanitarian groups raised concerns that Defend Europe could endanger lives in the central Mediterranean if it interrupts rescue missions, but the group now claims it is merely monitoring NGO activity and will conduct refugee rescues if needed. So far, activists on board have been shouting at humanitarian ships through megaphones and trolling other crews, including the Spanish charity Proactiva Open Arms, over radio by ordering them to leave the search and rescue zone. Robert Timm, a German member of the group, told The Independent the Sea Star would, quote, not interfere, unquote, with humanitarian operations. If we are called to help, we will help, he added, but we would make sure that they, the immigrants, don't get to Europe. Mr. Timm claimed the Sea Star would take asylum seekers to the closest safe African harbor instead of Italy, and named Tunis as a possibility, although Tunisian authorities are not believed to have agreed to the plan. He refuted the far-right label applied to the group and called Defend Europe a democratic movement, adding, "You can be against net immigration to Europe, and on the other hand, you can be compassionate with the people that drown. From our perspective, people don't drown because of Fortress Europe, but those NGOs are working as a pull factor." The activist claimed his organization would help enforce a controversial code of conduct imposed by Italy, which only 3 of 8 groups operating rescue ships have so far signed. Mr. Timm claimed Defend Europe has, quote, a lot of evidence, unquote, to support its position, but studies including a recent report by a House of Lords committee have not found any proof of NGO activity causing increased deaths or crossings. Research has found the EU's Operation Sophia anti-smuggling mission could itself be increasing death rates by causing smugglers to switch from wooden vessels to flimsy dinghies that cannot survive the treacherous crossing to Italy. Prosecutors in Sicily have ordered the seizure of 1 of 8 humanitarian rescue ships operating in the Mediterranean, the Luventa, over allegations its crew had contact with Libyan smugglers. Ambrogio Cartosio, a public prosecutor from Trapani, Italy, said there was evidence some members of the German charity Jugendrettet had contact with smugglers during one incident in September and 2 others in June, but he stressed that there was no evidence of the group receiving any money from Libyan traffickers and no indication of a wider conspiracy between the two groups, a favorite theory of the European far right. My personal conviction was that the motive was humanitarian, exclusively humanitarian, Mr. Cartosio said. It would be fantasy to say there was a coordinated plan between the NGOs and the Libyan traffickers. The EU is training and equipping the Libyan Coast Guard, which is itself accused of killing, beating, and abusing migrants, and has given millions of pounds towards detention centers and other controls by the fragile Libyan government of national accord. The United Nations has warned of widespread rape, abuse, forced labor, kidnapping, and ransom in the country, where smugglers have expanded a profitable trade in the chaos of the continuing Libyan civil war. Libya is now the main launching point for overloaded boats to Europe, where almost 120,000 migrants have arrived so far this year, mainly from Nigeria, Guinea, Bangladesh, Syria, the Ivory Coast, and other sub-Saharan African countries. Well, that was a rather dry report for putting the news out there that these idiots had put together a half-assed attempt to take to the sea to prevent migrants from making it to Europe, only to find themselves, well, after all the trouble they had getting a boat at all, they can't even keep the thing floating and operating. No surprise, I guess, but interesting follow-up nonetheless. Thanks to everybody who sent it to me. Got another story I can share with you, too, that's sort of a follow-up. Of course, when we left on Friday, when I finished recording, I guess, for Friday, it was Thursday evening, and I was pretty sure that we needed to get a Steve Bannon retrospective on the air, just in case he was gone, and of course, he was gone probably by the time we aired on Friday, so at least we were somewhat timely. So we want to sneak this one in now that Steve Bannon has skulked off back to Breitbart, which is a story in itself, really. I doubt very much, and most people, I think, were not caught by surprise by that at all, and nobody really believed he had disassociated himself from Breitbart, and he transitioned back there relatively smoothly. So we won't give up on beating him over the head, because he's not really leaving Trump world. No one ever does. But anyway, I thought we would add this one from The Intercept. This also a couple days old. Peter Maas on this one. I grabbed this one out of curiosity. Steve Bannon said he learned to fear Muslims when he visited Pakistan, except he was probably in Hong Kong. Now, what could that possibly mean? I picked this one up based on the headline. If you ask Steve Bannon how he got the idea that Muslims in the Middle East are a civilizational threat to America, he will say that his eyes were first opened when he served on a Navy destroyer in the Arabian Sea. At least, that's what he told the journalist Joshua Green, whose new book about President Donald Trump's senior counselor is a bestseller. It was not hard to see, as a junior officer sitting there, that the threat was just going to be huge, Bannon said. He went on to say, we'd pull into a place like Karachi, Pakistan. This is 1979, and I'll never forget it. The British guys came on board because they still ran the port. The city had 10 million people at the time. We'd get out there, and 8 million of them had to be below the age of 15. It was an eye-opener. We'd been other places like the Philippines where there was mass poverty, but it was nothing like the Middle East. It was just a complete eye-opener. It was the other end of the earth. That's Bannon's version, but there are a few problems with it. The port of Karachi, turns out, I love the research on things like this. The port of Karachi was not run by the British in 1979. Karachi, which is the commercial hub of Pakistan, had a population that was well short of 10 million. It was about half that. And it's not usually considered part of the Middle East. But the biggest problem is the destroyer Bannon served on, the USS Paul F. Foster, never visited Karachi while Bannon was aboard. I skimmed the first couple paragraphs of this story when I first heard about it, just to see what it was all about. And it, of course, occurred to me, I mean, for all the disgustingness that Bannon brings to the White House and all the reasons why we think he's a complete jackass and an evil bastard, and among other things, I would say, well, there were plenty of good reasons to think that, but this added a new dimension to it. Not new to the Trump world, but new for Bannon. Bannon was as big a liar and an exaggerator and a fabulist as Trump. And this about his military record, which we know annoys Trump to no end, right? 6 sailors who served on the Foster with Bannon told The Intercept that the vessel did not stop at Karachi during its 1979 to 1980 deployment. The recollections of those enlisted men and officers are supported by the ship's deck logs, which show no stop on the way to the Arabian Sea and are available to the public at the National Archives. And a map of the Foster's port calls that was published in its cruise book shows stops in Hawaii, ooh, scary, Guam, good for the tourism, the Philippines, Christmas Island, Hong Kong, and Singapore, but not Karachi. It turns out that Bannon, who has drawn a large amount of criticism for his exclusionary stances on race, religion, and immigration, has also inaccurately described his military service, simultaneously creating an erroneous narrative of how he came to an incendiary anti-Muslim worldview that helps shape White House policy, or at least it used to. It's not clear whether Bannon's account of visiting Karachi is an intentional fabrication or a false memory that reflects his subconscious fears or something else entirely. Whatever the reason, it raises a lot of questions. Bannon did not respond to several inquiries from The Intercept. A close friend of Bannon's, who was in regular contact with him and spoke on condition of not being named, said Bannon had not read Green's book and that the quotes attributed to him had not been checked with him. Green, the author, told The Intercept that the interview with Bannon occurred in 2015 and was recorded and transcribed. The news of Bannon's problematic narrative comes at a delicate time for the former executive chairman of Breitbart News, which under his leadership produced incessant streams of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim stories. Bannon's Navy service has always been deeply relevant to his work at the White House because it has been used as a reason for giving him influence on military affairs that his critics believe he does not merit. Bannon reportedly has a tense relationship with the retired generals who occupy key positions in the Trump administration, Chief of Staff John Kelly, Defense Secretary James Mattis, and particularly National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. Earlier this month, the Washington Post reported that McMaster has been waging a campaign to cleanse the National Security Council of Bannon's allies, and the two men have argued about Afghanistan policy. In January, when a controversial presidential order gave Bannon a full seat on the Principals Committee of the NSC, the White House cited his service in the Navy, where he was a junior officer for 7 years with 2 deployments, first in the Pacific in 1978, the second to the Pacific and the Arabian Sea in 1979 and 80. He is a former naval officer, said White House spokesman Sean Spicer at the time. He's got a tremendous understanding of the world and the geopolitical landscape. Having the chief strategist for the president in those meetings who has a significant military background, I guess not really, to help guide what the president's final analysis is going to be, almost stopped on make there, is crucial. In April, after being heavily criticized for putting Bannon on the NSC, Trump withdrew the full seat, though Bannon reportedly continues to attend meetings as a visitor. The falsehood about Karachi is not the only questionable statement Bannon made to Green about his military service. Bannon may have exaggerated his active duty encounters with Iran. In the early months of 1980, Bannon was on board the Foster when, for about a month or less, it patrolled in the Gulf of Oman in the military run-up to the botched effort to rescue the American hostages who had been seized at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. A portion of Iran's coastline is on the Gulf of Oman, so we can basically blame the botched rescue on Steve Bannon, if you ask me. The only way I can describe Iran, Bannon told Green, is that it looked like the moon. You're literally months away from home, steaming across the ocean, these vast expanses. You get to this place, and it was like you'd landed on the moon. was like the 5th century, completely primeval. There are two apparent problems with Bannon's description of Iran. No surprise there, I guess. The first is that Iran in 1980 was anything but 5th century primeval. Its per capita income was about $2,500, making it a mid-ranking country at the time, thanks to its oil reserves. Iran's major cities were fairly well developed. Although it had large stretches of lightly populated territory, and still does, Iran wasn't the moon or even Mongolia. Lots of developed countries have large stretches of empty land, and people tend to cluster in urban areas that occupy relatively little national territory. No surprise. There is one more potential problem with Bannon's Iran story and his Islamophobia origin as well. We'll get to that after this next break for station identification. Welcome back to the last segment of the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Getting ready to wind down the show as we wind down the music, and we were returning to our read of the Intercept's piece on the veracity of Steve Bannon's claims about his service in the Navy and how it influenced the genesis, I guess, of his Islamophobia. When we last left, he had just been bragging on his experience in sailing and cruising the Iran coastline. He had said, described Iran as looking like the moon and that the place was positively primeval. Of course, the problem with that is, well, sailing along the coastline of a Middle Eastern nation won't necessarily tell you anything at all about what's going on in the interior. That's the case with many places, Middle Eastern or otherwise. But perhaps the bigger problems with it is, of course, he described it as being completely primeval, but Iran was, in fact, quite developed and one of the wealthier nations in the world, and certainly in the region at the time. Another potential problem, the article says, with Bannon's Iran story is that from the bridge of the Foster, where he served as a navigator, it would have been difficult at most times to see Iran with any clarity, according to several officers who served on the ship. The Foster cruised in international waters as an escort to the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier, usually at least a dozen miles away from Iran, the officer said, and that was too far away to see anything with ordinary binoculars. The Foster was equipped with what's known as big eyes on the signals deck above the bridge, high-powered binoculars that are so big they are physically mounted on a ship, usually on a tripod. It was not part of a navigator's job to use the big eyes, according to the officers, but even if a navigator ascended to the signals deck to take a leisurely look, not much could be seen from such a distance. Bannon's own narrative about how he came to fear Muslims is politically important. He is one of the most openly anti-Muslim officials in Trump's chaotic entourage and is reported to have overseen the drafting of the controversial Muslim travel bans that Trump issued in his first weeks in office. The fact that a key part of Bannon's narrative is invented would seem to suggest that his anti-Muslim views come from a different place that is perhaps darker than what he is comfortable sharing with the public. In fact, there is an embarrassing hint in what Bannon told Green that he wittingly or unwittingly transferred to Karachi, a crowded scene he had witnessed in an entirely different port while he served on the Foster, Hong Kong. Bannon told Green that he vividly recalled how the British guys came on board because they still ran the port, which wasn't true for Karachi at the time, but was true for Hong Kong, which was under British rule when Bannon visited it. According to two officers who spoke to The Intercept, it was ordinary during port visits to Hong Kong for a British official, or several of them, to come on board to inform the ship of the logistics of the port, or as a social courtesy. As an above-deck officer, Bannon would have been in the areas where the visiting British officials were welcomed and probably would have seen them. If this is the case, Bannon's narrative of seeing a vast Muslim crowd in the Middle East and sensing that threat these people and their region would pose to America falls apart in a different and perhaps more embarrassing way than sheer fabrication. The crowds he would have seen in Hong Kong, which according to crew members I talked with was indeed overflowing with Chinese at the time, many of them quite poor, were overwhelmingly not Muslim. Only a small number of Chinese are Muslim, and certainly not Middle Eastern. It seems possible that Bannon may have consciously or subconsciously transposed the non-Muslim crowd he saw in Hong Kong and turned it into a Muslim crowd he did not see in Karachi. This raises the question of whether Bannon's underlying anxiety arises less from a threat purportedly presented by Muslims and more from a general anxiety about non-white foreigners, whether Muslim or Buddhist or any religion. Very interesting possibility. Of course, there's always the possibility he made the whole thing up as well. Also, I'm not even entirely clear, like, what, if I pulled into a port and I saw that there were 5 million people there and believed it was 10 million, but then thought that over 80% of them were under 15, I don't know that I would pick up what the threat is. Maybe he's a more strategic thinker than I am. Maybe it's something completely different. Maybe he's just paranoid. But to me, I would say, boy, there are a lot of young people here, and I don't know if it would have registered with me as a threat. I suppose if I was serving in the Navy at the time and I was trained to see everything as a threat, it's possible that might have come. And there's a strategic reason for believing that a population I guess you'd have to first assume that they'd have some reason to be hostile with the United States, which in 1979, 1980 is not necessarily the case, no matter where you are, with very few exceptions. Obviously, we would have known something about that in Iran, but I don't know why Karachi would have posed that threat. Certainly not Hong Kong at the time. But yeah, you'd have to be a certain kind of thinker, I guess. And, maybe it's wise to think that way and think strategically. But the idea of so many young people being under the age of 15 or whatever it was, I don't know that would strike me as a danger. But then, of course, what do I know? I would have to actually see something like that in order for it to spark some sort of thought like that in my brain. And we don't even know if that happened with Bannon. We can't even get that much out of him straight. One more thing probably worth getting on the record about Steve Bannon, the person, if you can call him that we've brought up in the past, and I don't know, I guess we've got a little bit of clarification here coming from Share Blue Media. This is written up by Jason Bradbury on this one. It's not a name I recall seeing before, but anyway, you'll recall hearing the story before. Remember when we learned about Steve Bannon and his weird history as relates to, in particular, his successive rental of 1, 2, 3 houses in Florida, and the weird lifestyle that we kind of got hints that was lived in these houses, whether it involved Bannon or not. I can't be 100% sure. A little bit more follow-up on that one. It says here, in an exclusive and extensive interview for Share Blue Media, investigative journalist Jason Berry spoke to Lawrence Curtis, who lived in the Florida Party House, a house with an infamous reputation for drugs and porn, previously occupied by Trump strategist Steve Bannon. That does seem a little weird and a little more specific than we heard earlier, though there were certainly lots of weird rumors, like the one that stuck with me in particular was the one about the hot tub that got ruined as though it had been filled with acid. We never really did get to the bottom of that one. And this doesn't really get to the bottom of it either, but it does help fill in some of the blanks about what was going on there. When award-winning Miami underwater cinematographer Lawrence Curtis, really, underwater cinematographer? Okay. Lawrence Curtis moved into the lush Coconut Grove neighborhood of Miami, he had no idea the house he was renting would become a national story. But that's because he didn't know the prior tenant was Steve Bannon, advisor to Donald Trump's presidential campaign and now the chief strategist in the White House. In March 2017, the Washington Post published a profile on Bannon that included some shocking details, including the bizarre case of 1794 Opeechee Drive. I don't know what that's, Opeechee, O-P-E-C-H-E-E. Those of you in Miami area can tell me, or probably anywhere in Florida, you've run into something. They got some weird place names down in Florida. Anyway, 1794 Opeechee Drive, the house in Miami that Bannon claimed as his residence, along with his third ex-wife. The Miami-Dade Police Department's Public Corruption Unit launched an investigation into whether Bannon had fraudulently registered to vote in that county. Bannon had signed the lease, listed himself as an occupant, and paid the rent every month. One of Bannon's colleagues, Arlene Delgado, testified that she had met with Bannon at the house on Opachee Drive, which he described as my house, where she saw boxes, papers, and effects that indicated he lived there. They met, according to Delgado, because Bannon had moved to Florida and wanted to increase the presence of the far-right Breitbart News, of which he was executive chair. The meeting was corroborated by an email exchange between Bannon and Delgado. Bannon's ex-wife testified that he did indeed stay at the house with her, although she did not feel comfortable answering any further questions. In the final report dismissing the investigation, law enforcement found evidence that tends to indicate that Bannon did not intend to or actually did reside in that county, but there was not sufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bannon had knowingly committed voter registration fraud. It's kind of a confusing wording all by itself. The Washington Post focused primarily on the bizarre fact that Bannon listed the Opachee Drive house as his place of residence despite living in California. The article lightly touched on the state of disrepair in which Bannon left the house, including a bathtub apparently destroyed by acid. Weird that, didn't we read just the other day? Was it Rohrabacher, Dana Rohrabacher we were reading about, who had just left this rental house in such disgusting shape, and then we were reminded of Duke Cunningham and his weirdness, and what is it about these guys? They can't keep these places clean. I don't know. Anyway, the truth turns out to have been much worse than just that. When Curtis first saw the house, the real estate agent, Beatriz Portela, told him the previous tenants, quote, were not very upstanding people, unquote, and had severely damaged the property. They had put padlocks on all the doors, installed video cameras, and ruined the bathtub, kitchen counter, and floor. Worse, though, was that it had been a party house, she said, known for frequent drug use. Carlos Herrera, who owned the house with his wife, Andreina Morales, painted a picture of what initially seemed to be a normal tenancy, but soon evolved into an almost daily parade of debauchery and drug use, including run-ins with the police. The conclusion is she was probably cooking meth in here, Herrera said of Bannon's ex-wife. That would have explained the damage done to the bathtub and the kitchen sink. I don't know whether that really does. I imagine it doesn't. It's not good for it, but I have no idea what cooking meth will do to a bathtub. I'll have to take your word for it. Curtis heard the same stories of porn, drugs, and debauchery over and over again. Each person gave accounts that the house was used to film pornography. It's not that they were watching porn there, it's that they were filming it. Yikes. And had a constant flow of men, women, and even children at the house, and that blatant drug use was occurring at all hours of the night and day, Curtis said. At least 5 people told him tales of drug use and porn at the house. Felix, a handyman who frequently worked at the property, told Curtis he had personally, quote, witnessed women and men being filmed in the act, unquote. He described the buckets of chemicals and bags of trash and rags he had to remove. He spent hours scrubbing the master bathtub, which appeared melted by some form of acid. Felix suspected the bathtub had been used for making drugs. Curtis heard similar stories from the pest control serviceman. In fact, Curtis said he did so in an almost gleeful and boastful manner. The pest control worker described witnessing drug use each time he came to the house, even at early day hours. He told Curtis it would blow his mind to know what went on in the house. An unnamed male tenant who said, an unnamed male tenant, he said, who was a, quote, heavy-set man, don't know who that might be, offered him girls for sex and or drugs in lieu of payment, but he never accepted because he could lose his job. When the oven range needed repair, the repairman refused to come to the house. Despite the service warranty, Curtis said he was told no one would come if the same people were living in the house, because that house is evil and the people are evil. The company ultimately agreed to send someone after being assured the prior tenants were gone. When Curtis opened the gate, the repairman said with a seeming relief, "You aren't him." He proceeded to work on the range and also share his own horror stories about the previous tenants. He told Curtis that on several occasions when he would arrive to service the house, the tenants would scream at him to leave and threatened him with violence. At other times, when he was allowed into the house to perform work, he observed topless and naked men and women and the constant presence of drugs, which they would sometimes offer to him. He told Curtis it was the worst experience of his life, and that he did not want anything to do with those evil people. "You have no idea what kind of stuff went on in that house," he said. One day, Curtis said, a woman came to the house asking for, quote, Steve, or his ex-wife, whatever her name was. She appeared distraught when he told her they no longer lived there. She stood outside the gate for several minutes in a daze. I assumed she was probably a regular visitor to the house looking for drugs from the previous tenants, Curtis said, but I didn't realize just how bad the drug use in the house had been at the time. I firmly told her to leave and to not come back. Meanwhile, according to the realtor, the neighbors had formed a committee, quote, in an effort to get the owners to evict, unquote, the tenants before they ultimately left. In September 2016, upon returning from a filming in the South Pacific, Curtis came home to a pile of mail addressed to Steve Bannon and his ex-wife. Curtis would write "return to sender" on the mail, but the flow of bills, notices from the city of Miami, and letters from the Bank of Ireland started piling up. That's when the landlord finally told Curtis about the identity of the former tenants. He told me that Bannon was indeed the previous tenant who caused such drama, Curtis said, and now that Bannon had joined Trump's presidential campaign, everyone was looking into Bannon and his history. He told me the FBI had contacted them, as well as several reporters and journalists, and that I should expect to be contacted as well. It was an unusual situation, to say the least, he added. But it was more than unusual. It also was a health hazard. Shortly after Curtis moved into the house, he started to experience a variety of symptoms: fatigue, inability to sleep, eye and skin irritation, chronic chest pain, and dizziness. The symptoms would subside when he was away from the house for weeks at a time, and they would resume when he returned. In March, Herrera finally admitted to Curtis that the prior tenants had manufactured meth there. That's when Curtis went to stay in a hotel. Again, his symptoms subsided. He also purchased kits to test for methamphetamine in the house. At first, he focused on the kitchen, master bathroom, and guest room. The tests showed a high level of contamination, so Curtis ordered 6 more tests and had them shipped overnight. The contamination was through the roof. So Curtis hired a company to test the house as well. The tests confirmed levels of meth and very high levels of cocaine. In May, Curtis moved out of the house. He still suffers from health problems related to living in the house once occupied by Steve Bannon. How weird is that? So what does this all actually mean now that Bannon is out there? And how out is he? Well, no one knows for sure, of course, and lots of suspicion still circulating that either, well, one, he's not really out, 2, that he might even be more free to strategize on behalf of Trump now that he's not under scrutiny as he was when he was inside the White House. 3, of course, his own claims that he actually went back to Breitbart to go to war on Trump's behalf, war being the term that they're using. And God, they just don't, and no end to the idiotic metaphors. And what else? They're calling him Bannon the Barbarian, and we're going to war, and winter is coming, and winter is here, all this kind of garbage. It's like the militia cosplayers. They just can't get enough of this stuff. Axios on, I don't know, when did they do this? Saturday, maybe, right as soon as it became known that he was out, they followed up, Saturday morning, with these bits and pieces here that got put together here. Apparently, I guess on the last day, the day he was fired, on Friday, Trump or Bannon didn't even bother to show up for work. The headline, by the way, it's Mike Allen and Jonathan Swan put this thing together under the headline, Trump they're quoting Trump here, who the F does this guy think he is? I guess this would eventually, we all figured this was coming. But I don't know whether, I don't know if I trust that this stuff is real or it's just staged as part of the act with these guys. Anyway, turns out it's being reported anyway. Bannon didn't bother to go to work on Friday. He knew it was over. At the end, Trump was beyond fed up, viewing Bannon as a self-aggrandizer. What? A self-aggrandizer in the Trump White House? No way. Who had built a personal narrative as the grand puppet master. Who the F does this guy think he is? Trump has said incredulously to associates. Axios' Jonathan Swan tells me it's no surprise Trump didn't issue a farewell message on Friday. The president can't stand Bannon at the moment. Trump eventually did tweet a belated thanks S for Steve, although that's not what I thought of, about Bannon on Saturday morning. Few people, though, are ever really gone from Trump world, and we bet it won't be long before Bannon is regularly gossiping with Trump and counseling him. Yeah, I guess that's probably not far off in the future either. I love the Axios style, by the way. Axios' Jonathan Swift tells me, well, aren't you Axios' Mike Allen? Do you really need to refer to him that way? It's not quite third person because he is a different person, but Axios' Jonathan Swan. They're going to promote Axios right in the front page of Axios, but, well, that's their habit. Anyway, there are a few more items here. It says that'll produce a huge tension if Bannon continues to counsel the president. Bannon is more ideologically aligned with Trump than are the other members of the inner circle, so Bannon will be in his head and in his ear while top advisors are counseling moderation. A big irony, Bannon got personally crossways with the president at a time when nationalist policies were ascendant with the president, with POTUS, as they love to put it. Trump agreed with Bannon's formula for confronting China on trade, although he later succumbed to the efforts of other officials to dial that back. And Bannon egged on Trump with the view that of Charlottesville that later drew such a backlash. The post-Bannon presidency says here, West Wing sources expect that with Bannon gone, the administration will be less likely to use trade as a weapon and more likely to flex military muscle against bad actors. Be smart. It says here, a huge tension that'll unfold beginning this fall is that Trump is more ideologically aligned with Bannon than he is with the more moderate officials who now surround him in the White House. And lastly, it says, so Steve Bannon will remain in the president's ear and in his head, telling Trump to be Trump, and that's a message this president has never been known to resist. They really stretched out a very small amount of information in the, I guess the most efficient possible way, repeating themselves a few times and making them into bullet points. That's Axios for you. There is a report, though, in the Washington Post, in the Fix section here, Callum Borchers wrote this up. Bannon basically saying Trump's campaign was a fraud. And here again, one of those instances which I think he's hyping the drama more than giving us the inside scoop about what's really going on. Stephen K. Bannon says he will be covering for President Trump on the outside, but the former White House chief strategist made a breathtakingly candid admission in the hours after his exit on Friday. The Trump presidency that we fought for and won is over, Bannon told the Weekly Standard. We still have a huge movement, and we will make something of this Trump presidency, but that presidency is over. It'll be something else, and there'll be all kinds of fights, and there'll be good days and bad days, but that presidency is over. What exactly did Bannon mean? Well, he got specific, but of course, I think if it means anything, it means, to translate Bannon's language, he's not there anymore, so he's not in charge, so that's over. In other words, the presidency for which Trump was likely to be popular among his base, Bannon thinks that's his doing, which lends some credence to the who the F does this guy think he is scenario. But what does Bannon really mean outwardly? He wants to say this. I just think his ability to get anything done, particularly the bigger things like the wall, the bigger, broader things that we fought for, it's just going to be that much harder, Bannon said of Trump. And what will be the effect of remaining White House advisors on Trump? I think they're going to try to moderate him, Bannon said. I think he'll sign a clean debt ceiling. I think you'll see all this stuff. His natural tendency, and I think you saw it this week in Charlottesville, his actual default position is the position of his base, the position that got him elected. I think you're going to see a lot of constraints on that. I think it'll be much more conventional. The line about Trump's natural tendency is exactly what Bannon meant about covering for the president. When Trump fails to deliver something he promised as a candidate, Bannon will assure the faithful that their president's heart was in the right place, but that the swamp got in his way. But the bigger takeaway here is that Bannon believes Trump will fail. The wall? Probably not going to happen. Sweeping tax cuts? Bannon predicted they'll do a very standard Republican version of taxes. Repealing Obamacare? Please. Bannon called the GOP plan that Trump backed a half-hearted attempt at Obamacare reform. That's right, reform. Bannon wouldn't even call it a repeal effort. The short translation is that Trump's campaign was a fraud. The ideas that Trump sold and his supporters bought are unlikely to turn into actions, according to Bannon. It sounds like Bannon, who will return to Breitbart News, will pin the blame on everyone around the president rather than on the man himself. The question is whether the voters who put Trump in the Oval Office will be so charitable. Of course, every indication is that they will be, and every indication is that, it's an interesting amalgam of thoughts here. On the one hand, it certainly seems like Bannon is crediting himself for all that made Trump popular, and it might even be true to some extent. On the other hand, he does say he's going to continue to try and fight on Trump's behalf and cover for him and try and maintain the support of his base for him. But in service of what? I guess we're just not really sure. Well, all of these things do appear to be falling apart. And, I'm grateful that they are, I guess. And I do wish that, I don't know how likely it really is that people, if they're being fed a fresh diet of Breitbart garbage every day, I suppose it's entirely possible. They may come away and believe that the guy was just overcome by the swamp. But I don't know why I would depend on logic at this point, but how do you overcome all the campaign rhetoric about how he's the only one who can do this and I alone can fix it and all the things that made him a magical figure to his base, that, it's almost impossible to change the way Washington works, but I can because I'm such a great deal maker and I alone can fix it and I know what's wrong because I'm part of the problem, which was amazing. I guess that should have been our signal. If he could get away with that, he can get away with pretty much anything. So I guess I don't hold out too much hope that anybody's going to wake up to this stuff, but things are slowly eroding. Greg, if he were here today, would no doubt remind us, if I were able to make room for him to come on today, would no doubt remind us that, there are people who will never abandon Trump. It's true, but far more people whose support is softening, who are willing to walk away or are just willing to continue to support him but stay home during the next election. I mean, the numbers are the numbers. Support for him is eroding and it continues to fall, even though the newspapers are doing everything they can to bend over backwards and find supporters who will never waver and interview every single one of them 6 times so that we never lose sight of the fact that there are people out there who are willing to fool themselves into believing in Trump no matter what, forever and ever. Yada yada, and no change on the horizon for any of them. We're all sick of such pieces, of course, but what can you do? They seem to think that there's a bottomless appetite for this, and so far, I don't know. I don't have anything to point at to prove them wrong, except for the fact that as we have been unable to put together a show for today that included Greg, I guess we also have respite for Armando, who doesn't have to message behind the scenes or try and get into the show to say, no, Greg is wrong. All these people are idiots and they'll never give up on him, even though support is eroding and we can, numbers are numbers, but I don't believe in it anyway. And it's all special sauce and so much garbage. Anyway, It's been some kind of week, hasn't it? Well, we're almost back for our live shows. They will return later on this week. Thursday will be the first day of school for the kids. Back on our regular schedule, back at home, back at the desk as usual, and we'll be able to bring you live shows once again and catch up on all the craziness just in time for another crazy weekend. It really is pretty amazing. Thank you so much for hanging with us through all of this. We will be back with you shortly live. In the meantime, stay tuned next for the after show, wrapping up on all the fresh news of the day.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thanks again for sticking with us. We'll be back with you shortly. I can't believe how much I've had to miss out on. Believe me, it's killing me not to be able to talk with you live and to get your feedback and comments. I can't wait to be back on the air with you Thursday. Hang on until then. We'll see you again tomorrow, though, with another new show.